To my talk, and it is going to be about the burbot. Love is in the water. It is February, and that is the time when love happens for the burbot. And I'm going to go through kind of a broad overview of the ecology, the life history of the burbot, and then we're going to actually look inside and look at an actual burbot. I think it's going to be a fun combination of information, facts, and actual science. So just first off, so I am a fisheries specialist, and I work for Wisconsin Sea Grant, and what we are a program based in coastal states, and that includes states like Wisconsin. From the very beginning, Sea Grant's been around about 50 years, and we have a long history of being in the Great Lakes from the very beginning of the program. So we work with lots of different coastal folks with coastal problems. Broadly, we have kind of this three-legged stool, we like to refer to it as: extension, education, and research. And some of that research is us going out doing research. It's also us funding Wisconsin researchers to actually do science to help with answering questions and the stakeholders. And in the middle there, the focus areas. Those are broadly 4 different areas that if you go to Alaska Sea Grant, if you go to Florida Sea Grant, or here in the Great Lakes at one of our Sea Grant programs, we're all working in those similar areas. So for me as a fisheries specialist, which is a job I've been doing now for 8 years, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, definitely something I do, but healthy coastal ecosystems, the fish are in the ecosystems, and even the other 2, education, resiliency, it's all touching on the kind of fish world. So, lots of interesting things happening in the world of Sea Grant, the world of the Great Lakes science, and I'm going to talk a bit about, a single species, maybe one that you haven't heard of before, you haven't heard of the burbot. A lot of these examples from the history are going to come from the Great Lakes, just because that's, really an area that I think I'm really passionate about. But for us in Wisconsin, we've got 820 miles of coastline. I like to point that out. It's really exciting. We are a coastal state. I could jump in a boat if it wasn't winter, and I could go really anywhere in the world by boat from here, as long as my boat isn't too long. So first off, we'll start, what is the burbot? Lota, that's our scientific name. And here's just here's a burbot looking right back at you, saying hello. The burbot's it's a fish of many names, and really with lots of species, when we start looking at common names, there's a whole variety. Local people, local areas come up with their own names for lots of things. Mize is the Ojibwe name, so there's a name that's been used for the burbot for a long time. For us in Wisconsin, the lawyer down at the list there, Great Lakes states, they call them lawyers. Is it because they're slimy and they really twist around? I don't know. There's some history there, but definitely a local name, especially here in Door County and along our coasts. But some other fun ones too. I mean, the mudblower, the dogfish, the spineless catfish, the mother of eels, the lush, the loach, and the freshwater cod. I think that's another interesting one because the burbot is a member of the cod family. The gadiforms are kind of this wide group across the world that have, those are the cods. There's lots of diversity in the cod order. The family Lotidae, which is where burbot is located, these are just some examples on this slide of different Lotidae family members. And you can see some similarities, length of fins, location of fins, some of the facial hair that some of those fish have. There's some similarities there. The really unique thing about the burbot, though, it's a freshwater fish. In the world of cod, the burbot is a freshwater species, the only one in the whole world. Another species in a different family, but a cod you have probably heard of, you've probably eaten it, at least historically, the Atlantic cod. So, you know, when you go to a fish fry, cod's on the menu, you might be eating a cousin of the burbot here. Where can you find the burbot? You know, burbot are, you know, sort of geographically, they're a northern hemisphere fish, really north of 40 degrees latitude. And, you know, from the map, North America, Asia, Europe, they have a very wide range of habitats and areas that they're found in. If we kind of zoom in just to the lower 48 states, we can get an idea. These are just sort of the lighter color brown. These are the native watersheds where they're found. You can see some kind of, you know, the large rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, you know, also found in some large rivers as well. But if you look at Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Great Lakes, it's a river fish, but it's also a lake fish, especially those deeper, colder lakes. If you look at Wyoming, and Wyoming's, you know, one of those square states, this big brown, dark brown is indicating an occurrence of burbot that's outside of its native range. And that's actually in the Green River Basin, where it's actually now someone put it over into a reservoir on the wrong side of the watershed boundary. And now it's actually a concern where, you know, it might be messing with some of the native fish there. So, you know, interesting stories happening on this map. Just a little lay of the land for the burbot. We can start looking at that. Some of the characteristics, you know, starting at the chin, the barbel. And the burbot here has sort of a single barbel. That's you know, sort of a distinctive characteristic, one on the bottom. You know, potentially those off the nostrils there up on the top of the snout, but it's a lot smaller. One of the distinctive features, so that single barbel, especially in the Great Lakes, that's going to be an indicator that we're looking at a burbot, but also the location of the pelvic and the pectoral fin. So pectoral fins I like to think of as the arms on the fish, pelvic fin more like the legs. And you know, one of the distinctive features we see in cod and in burbot is that pelvic fin is really up here in the front. So the insertion or the point where the fin meets the body on the burbot is actually closer to the snout than the pectoral fin. So it's as if my legs were, you know, attached to my body up closer to my head than my arms. So, you know, just sort of an oddity compared to a lot of our other Great Lakes and Wisconsin fish. And something that if I'm out in the field and I've got kind of an unknown fish in my net, I'm trying to identify it. Those are the types of characteristics I'm going to look for. Two dorsal fins on the back, kind of a small one and then a longer one. Caudal fin in the back, and it's a fairly round caudal fin, pretty long anal fin, and then the lateral line. You can see that line running along the side of the fish. And lateral lines have kind of these specialized cells. They can actually detect movement and vibration in the water, almost like you know, kind of this extra sensory perception where can almost feel things that are far away, and that might be useful if predators in the area or they're looking for food. And not very obvious, but very small scale. So although it is very smooth, very slippery, it is a scaled fish. In terms of size, lower right there, that is the world record angler caught burbot at the moment, caught in Saskatchewan. So 25.2 pounds, 41 inches. Although in the records, you know, reports in Siberia of some burbot that were 55 to 65 pounds. Probably not angler caught, but definitely fish that were out there, and you know, even longer fish potentially. When we look at burbot, males and females are going to be similar size, so there's not any dimorphism between the sexes. And then just a kind of an example of what growth might look like for the burbot. This is some data from Lake Superior. So you see kind of a faster growth in the first couple of years, and then pretty steady growth through time. And you know, in this example, we've got a 12-year-old burbot that might be between 25 and 30 inches long. So, I think this is what we want. This is why you're here. You were like, oh, I don't know enough about the love life of burbot. I want to learn more. And that's what we're going to talk about because Burbotine Day is on the way, and it's a cold holiday. It's a holiday that happens under the ice. It happens in February and March. And that is what I'm talking about. That's when burbot go to spawn. And why this is interesting, very few fish spawn in the winter. This is, we've got some fish like the whitefish and the cisco, they spawn in the fall. A lot of fish spawn in the spring or in the summer. So, spawning right now is it's a tactic. There's not a lot of competition out there. There's not a lot of predators. Other fish are kind of inactive. So the burbot are taking advantage of that. I've got this is from a report in the 30s kind of describing that spawning event of the burbot in one of their habitats, kind of shallow water, protected bays, and they're out there at night and describe it as a tangled, nearly globular mass of moving, writhing lawyers. There you go. Put that on a billboard for your law firm. I think an increase in business potentially. And he also goes on to describe it. The whole aggregation of burbot reminded me of a knot of earthworms being taken out of a bait pail. So I think we can, if you've ever done that, you can imagine what this, 10 to a dozen burbot kind of just rolling around in the bottom in the middle of the night, spawning. Burbot will also spawn in rivers and streams. And Sigurd Olsen, the nature writer, in his book, Listening Point, has a whole chapter called The Spawning. And it's actually him going out at night in February, sub-zero temperatures to observe this phenomenon. And in this is sort of boundary waters, northern Minnesota, in the rapids. He writes, not until we were within 10 feet of the rapids did we shine our lights and we saw such a sight as is seldom glimpsed by modern man, a struggling, squirming mass of fish churning the water into a froth. So, here's another strategy that burbot are using. They're in this highly oxygenated, very turbulent water. Their eggs, this type of the river, it's going to be very rocky, lots of good habitat for those eggs to kind of settle down onto the bottom. And those eggs will hang out for about 4 to 5 weeks, and then they'll hatch, and they get kind of a jump start on the year. But out in the Great Lakes as well, and this is really the only data that I collected that I'm going to share. It is as part of a study that I did riding on commercial fishing boats. Throughout the year, we were actually looking at catching whitefish in the trawl net, which you kind of drag along the bottom. But burbot were sort of an incidental species that we caught. So, some actual data here out in Lake Michigan. When do we actually see the most burbot? Well, we see them February and March, and we see them generally between 100 and 149 feet of depth. Don't see them much the rest of the year. So that is probably kind of the deeper water spawning that's going on. This wasn't the day, so maybe they're just hanging out there as well, but spawning in that area. And this is a kind of a fun one. It's actually recently documented the song of the burbot, and can we hear it? And it should be playing, hopefully. Let me check that. So it's gonna, they actually documented the sound that the burbot makes, and a series of slow knocks to fast buzzing. So really, you can hear it here, it's gonna pick up. So there it goes. That is the kind of spawning song of the burbot. So imagine you're under the ice. It's nighttime. It's dark. How are you going to find the other burbots? And that's a sound they make. They actually have a gas bladder, swim bladder inside their body. They use that to regulate their depth, stay neutrally buoyant. But they also have muscles that run along that they can vibrate and actually create that sound. So this paper published in 2014. So really a new phenomenon that's, getting some research. Yeah, you would not be able to hear it above water. I mean, they need very specialized kind of in the water acoustic measurement things to measure that. Maybe if you were down on the bottom, hard to know. I'm not diving into the ice to find out. So, that's sort of setting the scene. The spawning has happened. Let's follow the burbot through their life and see what happens. Burbot are, kind of the strategy they take reproductively. They produce a lot of small eggs, and they put those out there and hope for the best. A bunch of burbot from Lake Superior, they had a range between 300,000 and over 1.3 million eggs per female, with an average of about 812,000 eggs. So, the strategy here is to put a lot of eggs into the system, hope that they get fertilized, and hope that enough make it to survive. Other fish might invest more into fewer eggs, but they're larger, they have a little more resources, and that's not what the burbot do. So the eggs are going to kind of generally go where they're spawned at. That might be a gravelly, rocky area, maybe a sandy area. They're going to sit on the bottom, develop slowly over a little over a month, and then they're going to hatch out. And we've got a little picture there on the right, a small larva with the yolk sac, and some great pictures here. Patrick Blaufus is actually a fellow working with Wisconsin Sea Grant and the Northern Aquaculture Demonstration Facility up in Red Cliff, doing aquaculture research. But before he came and worked with us in Wisconsin aquaculture issues, he was actually out west working on burbot aquaculture out there. And I'm actually going to touch on that kind of briefly at the end, that whole kind of stuff that's going on out west. So pretty cool science around the burbot. As burbot develop, always some interesting, when you look at larval fish, starting on kind of that left side, you can see the 3.5 millimeters. You can follow the size there. I mean, millimeters are small. These are very small when they hatch, and they don't look, you wouldn't look at that kind of first larval fish and say, well, that's a burbot, because it doesn't look like much. And a lot of larval fish look like that. It takes time as they kind of develop more. I think that the lower right, you might start to say, well, that could be a burbot. And they develop kind of slowly through that first spring and into summer, and really exhibit some rapid growth in their first year. So, by the end of that first growing season could be in the 3 to 8 inch range for a burbot that was spawned much earlier in the year. And then those little burbot are going to hang out. They're going to hide. They're pretty vulnerable to predation at that point. Bigger fish might want to eat them. So you might be more likely to find them in shallower areas, rocky areas, maybe some vegetation, just looking for some protection. The habitat in general, I mean, in the Great Lakes, those are deep, fairly cold lakes, but, found through all 5 Great Lakes. Throughout Wisconsin, a lot of lake habitats. To the south, those big river systems, those are rivers. And then as you move north, you might see the Canadian Great Lakes, you'd see burbot there, but then you also see very large river systems in the north, cool water, large rivers, and probably have burbot there, pretty widespread through that range. Some more interesting behaviors, and this was, as I was kind of reading up on, the science of burbot, I found this paper that was actually looking at some biogenic structures, they're called. So biogenic, some animal, in this case a burbot, made those structures. And, the reason there's a little submersible there is they actually took this submersible, went out into Lake Superior, took it down to 450 to 1,200 feet deep, and actually observed these burbot kind of hanging out in these crevices that they created. The picture on the right, there's kind of a runway there around a area that had collapsed. The burbot actually made this little overhang until it collapsed, and then there's that kind of U shape on the top, and that's a little area that they can kind of hide in and run around in and be away from predators. A similar behavior, you'll see this in the ocean with other cod species, where they're kind of staying out of the line of fire from much larger predators, sharks, killer whales, that type of thing. So, maybe not a necessary behavior, particularly in the deep Great Lakes, but something that carries over in the kind of cod biology. So that's sort of the growth. Now let's look at burbot and their place in the food web. What do they eat, and what eats them? So very early with fish, they hatch, they get a little yolk sac, and that's the nourishment. But once that's gone, it's time to go out on your own and find some food. And this is just some results here from a study looking at Lake Huron larval burbot. So those really tiny burbot, they collected those, and then they looked inside the stomachs to see, hey, what did larval burbot eat? And kind of a range of things. It's all, mostly zooplankton, rotifers in there. This little circular thing is actually the veliger, or the free swimming stage of a quagga mussel. And what they found, they actually looked at what was the food available when the burbot were there, and what did they have in their stomach. And they could actually, using those comparisons, say that there was a preference towards the cyclopoids, those are copepods, and then nauplii up here in the upper left. Nauplii are just sort of small, immature copepods of some sort. And then they actually avoided some of the other types of zooplankton. The cladocerans, or water fleas, they avoided those. Calanoid copepods, those big ones. Those are generally larger than a lot of the other copepods. They're faster, they're harder to catch. And so burbot seem to be avoiding those. The veligers avoided those, and then rotifers as well. So, some interesting things happening in that early time. As burbot get larger, they kind of shift away from eating the zooplankton, and they also kind of move down lower into the food, or into the lake. So they're more closer to the bottom, and they're feeding on larger invertebrates. So we've got the mysis there, or possum shrimp. On the left, we've got diparia, which historically was this great food source out in the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan. I mean, that was the food that really nourished the lake whitefish populations. And as quagga mussels, zebra mussels and quagga mussels increased, diparia really dropped off to where there's very few out there. Unfortunately, that was a great food source replaced by a pretty marginal food source. In a lake like Lake Superior, you might see more burbot eating diparia. Also, we've got some eggs there. We've got some crayfish. The eggs, when burbot are sampled in sort of the November time of year in an area that has Cisco, or you might have heard of them called as lake herring, you may see them just full of those eggs because, again, very abundant and a good food source. And I got a picture because it's also a food source that people like to eat, especially in Scandinavia. And then as burbots get larger, basically over 20-inch burbot, it's eating fish most of the time. This is going to vary. They're kind of a generalist, where if a fish, whatever the prey that's available and abundant, they're probably going to eat that. We have a lot of kind of benthic or bottom-associated species, like the sculpins down here, the bloater, which is a coragonid. It's a kind of a native cousin to the whitefish, and in the closely related to the Cisco. Newer arrivals, we've got a couple invasive species, the smelt, the alewife, and the goby. Diets of burbot out in Lake Michigan these days generally have a lot more round gobies, just because round gobies are pretty abundant and they're on the bottom, and that's where the burbots are going to be. But I've seen a fair number of sculpins in the stomachs of burbot as well. Don't worry about the chart, but just some, sort of the interesting percentages here. So this was 1972 published study, burbot in Lake Superior, looked at a lot of stomachs, and I think the interesting thing, kind of over a wide range of burbot size. 91% of those burbot stomachs had fish, but a lot of them also had mysis and diaparia. And the interesting one on the bottom, debris, 70%. And what Bailey thought was, well, the presence of rocks and wood chips and clinkers and plastic and other inert materials was suggesting that there was sort of this indiscriminate feeding going on. So, the burbot is lunging for that food, probably, and if it's near the bottom, maybe gulping up whatever's on the bottom there too, picking up some wood chips. Not a very fastidious guest to have at your table. They're a bit messy. Might eat your napkins if you invite them over. We also see some movement up and down in the water column. So, generally burbot hiding out sort of deeper in the water during the day. And we'll see that with a lot of different species. Possum shrimp, for one, they're down deep in the darker areas during the day and then move up at night when it's harder for them to be seen and eaten by things that like to eat them. Burbot might be, moving up into shallower water, feeding on, different food that's available and avoiding some predation from predators. And I'll probably tell you what that predator is likely to be. Because we're in the Great Lakes and that's where I work, there's some interesting history and stories of the food web changing in the Great Lakes that, has some bearing on, what has happened to the burbot. Back in the 20s, just to get a perspective historically on what burbot numbers might have looked like, an example from Lake Ontario where burbot were so abundant, especially late winter and early spring, to seriously interfere with the operation of commercial fishermen. So, abundant enough that they were nuisances when someone might have been lake trout or other more desirable species. If we look to the sort of historical food web of Lake Michigan, historically in the sort of dark blue here, we've got, sculpins, we still see those. We have a whole mix of these corygonids, deep water ciscos, the bloater, lake herring, and up at the top, we've got, sort of the top predator is the lake trout, and off to the side is the burbot, which, abundant, also a top predator, but not quite as important as the lake trout. And big changes happen in Lake Michigan. The kind of flock of ciscos, the lake herring, they decline. There's a lot of unregulated fishing happening. There's pollution, habitat destruction, lots of stuff happening in the lake. And then on top of that, the sea lamprey arrived. And in the Lake Michigan, Huron, Superior, basically the 1930s, sea lamprey appear. They're native to the North Atlantic. They're a parasitic fish, very simple fish, jawless. They attach to things and they, rasp a hole in the side, suck out blood, basically be vampires of the Great Lakes to really put a contrast to the Burbotine Day Love Fest we're talking about now. We also have some horror shows out there as well. And, sea lamprey really went after lake trout hard. They also went after burbot. And by the middle 20th century, Lake Michigan basically has no lake trout left. Burbot greatly depressed. And that is when the alewife arrived. And they're there, but they really take advantage of a Lake Michigan that has few competition for them in the forage fish area, not a lot of predation pressure from other species, and sort of the big number with alewives, we say at peak alewife numbers, if we took all the fish in Lake Michigan, 90% of those would have been alewife. So, a non-native species to the Great Lakes, not in balance, things weren't that great. It's not all bad news though. Sea lamprey control was very active. It's one of the best, most successful invasive species controls in the world. We've got a couple different examples there from Superior, Michigan, and 85 to 95% reductions in those sea lamprey populations. And why that matters, if a lamprey got to an adult size, like in that picture, they probably killed about 40 pounds of fish. So that's a lot of impacts to whitefish, to lake trout, to burbot. And because of that success, we have kind of the food web that we have now, a mix of a lot of different species. Some of those are, lamprey are still there. We've got some new species like the quagga mussels and the gobies. We've got some desirable non-natives like the trout salmon that we grow in hatcheries, plant them into lakes, and create a valuable sport fishery. But burbot is still there, still a part of that food web. This is just a little more data looking at some trends in burbot. And this is from a U.S. Geological Survey that they run, pulling a big smallish bottom trawl at set points in Lake Michigan. And what we're looking at is some trend data, really low back in the 70s, early 80s. Some increases happened and then some declines. Probably part of that, as alewife declined, that was good for burbot. They were able to really reproduce a lot. There was also, sort of the similar years, a lot of bloater around. It's a good food source, but maybe a lake trout piece of that puzzle too, because who eats lake trout? Good question. When we look at burbot through their life, especially when they're small, larger fish are going to eat them. Smelt, perch, even a walleye might, if they encounter a burbot, which is also nocturnal, they might be eaten. But when we look at sort of the larger adult-sized burbots, definitely parasitic lamprey, sea lamprey are going to feed on them, but lake trout are really probably the main predator on burbot. We've got some examples we can actually look at, across the Great Lakes. One of the first big things that happened, this is an example from Lake Superior. Sort of starting on the left, we had higher lake trout densities, lower burbot densities. And as sea lamprey arrived, we saw declines in both lake trout and burbot. Those populations are both hit pretty hard. But because the burbot, as lamprey control starts, it's a success. Sea lamprey numbers decline. Burbot are able to respond pretty quickly. They're producing a lot of eggs. They're pretty resilient to that escape compared to the lake trout, which takes a lot more time, has more of a general recovery, also helped by stocking. And we see that as the lake trout numbers increase, down go the burbot. So, a pretty closely, fairly closely tied relationship between predation on burbot by lake trout. And, if we can look at the same study, actually kind of broke out different sizes of burbot. And it's really the smaller size burbot, basically a burbot that would fit into the lake trout's mouth. Those have had declines over time since the 70s. But the really large burbot that might, are probably too big for a lake trout to eat, have been pretty stable through time. What about other things? Other things eat or feed on burbot, and parasites are an example of that. And this is actually a senior thesis from a student at St. Norbert's College looking at burbot in Green Bay. Used a lot of burbot, opened them up, found the parasites, and actually a whole list of that of different types of parasites. And really most fish, if we look at a freshwater fish, we're probably going to find parasites. So another part of the whole ecosystem is in these parasites. So burbot, is it your dinner? Good question. Maybe it should be your February dinner of choice. It could be delicious. How do people get burbot? Well, ice fishing, that is probably anglers are most likely to encounter a burbot during the ice fishing period. This, especially now, this is burbot are spawning. They might be in more accessible shallow water. They're down near the bottom. And although they don't generally feed much while they're spawning, they're pretty voracious after they're finished spawning. So, keying into where those fish might be has actually led to, in certain places, the popularity of burbot, the eelpout fest up in northern Minnesota. And this, went for about 40 years until it kind of exceeded its carrying capacity. And they've had to cancel the last couple of years, and maybe it's over. It just got too big to manage because there was just a ton of people out on the ice, a lot of trash, and accountability of who had to deal with all that mess. But a potential popular pursuit of burbot here happening. Commercial fishing as well, although not a kind of mainly sought fish, definitely a part of the fishery. And just sort of an interesting tidbit that I learned, back in the olden days of commercial fishing, nets kind of treated with creosote, really hard on the fishermen's hands. They would actually use the oil from that liver of the burbot. You've heard of cod liver oil, people buy it, and the livers of the burbot are very oily, very high in omega-3s. And actually the graph there was from a study from Canada looking at, burbot as a food source for First Nations people. So, adding to their diet lots of healthy omega-3s, which are something that a lot of us need to eat anyway. Definitely this is just pulling some data together back to the 60s of total harvest of burbot by lake. There's some, lots of green here. Lake Michigan seems to be the most harvest happening. Sort of our peak up maybe around 300,000 pounds in total back in the 70s. Kind of a decline in recent decades, fairly stable around the lakes. And, without context, it's hard to know what this means. But in general, if we look at all of the Great Lakes commercial harvest, we're talking 44 million pounds of harvest. And the burbot right now, that might be 30,000 pounds out of 44 million. So a pretty minor player in commercial fisheries throughout the Great Lakes. Although certainly locally, out on Washington Island, fresh lawyers on display, and Ken Coyan out there, catching some burbot and putting them on plates. I think great use of that fish, and maybe some other potentiality there. And this is just a study, in my research from the 1920s, and kind of a glowing report of the potential of the burbot. The Cinderella of the fish world, despised because of its homely appearance, should take its proper place among the recognized profitable commercial fish. And the prospect of future marketing of burbot looks bright. And without a doubt, this fish can be turned into a source of profit for fishermen. And this is, 100 years later, we have not seen that happen. So, maybe a potential opportunity there. And certainly locally, you might see them in fish shops. You might see them up on Washington Island as well. And, if you're looking for a Great Lakes fish, if you're lucky enough to have a fish market close to you, you can always go and ask them. That's where I could, if I need burbot, I know a fisherman who can get me burbot. So why you might want them, you can eat them. Just a few recipes that I put together here, and just some thanks to our friends at Michigan Sea Grant who have pulled together a website called freshwaterfeasts.com, and you can check them out. And they actually featured my beer battered burbot recipe. So if you want to check that out, you can. It's a simple beer batter. It's got some Cajun seasoning in it. Dip it in there, deep fry it. It was delicious. Also, hey, Valentine's Day, don't splurge on lobster, poor man's lobster, or as I like to call it, lobster is the poor man's burbot. Another kind of plug to a Wisconsin Sea Grant program, eatwisconsinfish.org, and we've got a couple recipes for using burbot and a plate picture. It's just like scrolling through Instagram here. And another meal that I prepared, it's simple. You've got a loin kind of from the back of the burbot, cut it into little medallions, boil them for a few minutes until they're done, dip them in butter. Is there a better way to eat a fish?
Just like lobster.
Just like lobster, only better because it's local. So that's sort of the state broadly of the burbot. Let's gaze into the future a bit. In terms of their North American range, and this is just looking at conservation status. In general, there's some yellows and reds on this map, and that's really the southern end of their range. Concerns here, climate change is definitely a concern, warming waters. And in addition to climate change, if you look at those large rivers that they live in, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri, kind of a commonality there is large dam projects as well. So those large dams really change the flow regimes of the river, change the temperature profiles, and that hasn't been great news for the burbot. Farther north, in general, there's a lot of blues there. So Wisconsin, most of Canada, Alaska, Michigan, generally secure or apparently secure. And, I think one of the things here as well is we're not looking at a lot of burbot. We don't really talk about burbot very much. The climate side too, ice and winter, definitely changing. We are seeing, here in the Great Lakes, we're seeing a declining trend in ice cover. This year, it's certainly easy to look at the ice conditions right now, and on a day when 60 plus anglers had to be rescued off the ice out in Green Bay in kind of February, which doesn't seem typical. We see year to year really looking at this even longer series of sort of maximum ice coverage. In the last 20 or so years, we're seeing a lot more years with below average maximum ice cover compared to the start of that time series where generally it was above average. So declining ice cover, what does that mean for the burbot? I don't know that we know. And as we look throughout the kind of northern states and northern latitudes, there's a general declining trend of the length of the ice season, later ice on, earlier ice off, and that's been documented in Japan and the Madison Lakes, really all over the world. What it means for burbot, it's hard to say. Some people have looked at a little more in depth on the lake whitefish side of ice cover related to winter and water temperatures, and with a species like lake whitefish, which is spawning in the fall, eggs under the ice. Less ice cover might mean less production in some of those shallower habitats. Maybe that could be similar to burbot, we're not sure. Some other trade-offs, maybe more larval food for burbot though. That's a prediction with warmer waters. But maybe adults shifting with those whitefish to deeper waters. So, maybe it's time to think a bit more about burbot. In a state like Wisconsin, they're basically classified as a rough fish, not really much active management. Maybe that's okay because people don't catch them, but maybe it'd be better to know a little bit more about what's happening with their populations and what kind of management needs to be happening. And I think always you can kind of get down on the future and impacts of some of these species. What about some bright news and a kind of a great example of a lot of partners working together out west, where the Kootenai River system have this really culturally important and historically important burbot population. It was, historically this winter fishery for the indigenous people out there where, it's cold, it's winter, fresh fish were accessible in the winter. And even the early settlers to the west took advantage of that. But in the 70s, a big dam goes in upstream in Montana, and that actually really caused a population crash in the 70s onward in that Kootenai River. And looking at the map, you've got a river that starts in Canada, goes into Montana, where a dam is built that then affects the downstream, which is Idaho, and back into British Columbia. And so lots of efforts going on, including growing burbot, figuring out how to grow burbot in a hatchery so that they can be planted to help restore this population. So, some love of the burbot still happening. And then, with that, as I grab an actual burbot from over there that we can look at, I will leave you with some smelt wrestling to take a look at. One of my favorite pictures. 1930s, the smelt boom is happening. What are we going to do with them? Marinette, Wisconsin. How do you win at smelt wrestling? If anybody knows, well, whoever stuffed the most smelt in the other guy's trunks was the winner. So if you thought it was bad, wait until you lose at smelt wrestling. So thanks everybody. Lots of information there, and I talked for a long time as I do. But I also, we've got a treat. We have a actual burbot on the table in front of us. So, Paige can monitor the questions if you have them. And I am going to actually, go through this fish that we have here, point out some of the characteristics, cut it open, maybe see what it had to eat recently. Yeah, and so I hope you have a better understanding of the burbot and one of our many native species that need some love too. Oh, you want me to? I'll just exit out of that.
There you go. And then.
So let me stop, and I will stop sharing. Here we go. All right. So is it going to be that small for them? I suppose they're going to see all of those.
I don't think so. I think you get big. I think
okay.
The speaking speaker.
All right. So we have a burbot right here in front of us, and this is a fairly large burbot, and as I mentioned, we've got a single barbel in the front here. I'm gonna, right over this new computer, I'm going to bring that, oh, there it is. So single barbel right in the front. Looks like a balloon in the mouth. What that is actually the gas bladder, the air bladder in this burbot. When it was brought up in the net, it came up really fast and that expanded. It's called barotrauma. This would have been a concern if this fish was released, and I'm actually going to pop that to get it out of the way. All right, so that kind of makes our belly a bit smaller. We've got our pelvic fins right here. So again, pelvic fins in front of that dorsal fin right there. Pretty interesting. We've got you can kind of get an idea of what the gills look like right here. You can see that red. I mean, gills on a fish, that's where they exchange the gases that they need. They can get rid of things like CO2. They can take in oxygen. We breathe, they use that. Inside the mouth, pretty small, kind of these layers of kind of grasping, not necessarily teeth, not sharp, it's not like the mouth of a walleye, but it's gonna, really hold on to anything that they can grab a hold of. As we move back, we've got our dorsal fins. So again, we had two dorsal fins, kind of the small one in the front. longer dorsal in the back. Then to our caudal fin right here, pretty round, fairly long anal fin. With the vent here, that's where the poop comes out, which is coming out onto our table. So, a visual predator, eyes up front, but also with that barbel, able to kind of sense their environment and maybe find some prey with that as well. Nocturnal feeder, and looking at what's the coloration, it's a mottled brown, light and dark brown. So for a species like this, down near the bottom, a predator from the top might not see this burbot. It's going to blend in a bit more. Yeah, let's take a look at the inside, see what's happening in there. We actually dissected a burbot earlier in the day for a student group, and we had a female, and we'll see what this is going to be. There we go. All right. Ooh, this one is definitely a lot juicier than our burbot earlier today.
I feel like this one's less frozen.
Yeah, this one is less frozen. I did get these fresh last week, and then I froze them. So we will open this side up a bit more. And soak up some of our juices here. Ooh. Yeah, so inside, towards the front, we've got kind of this large, lighter colored organ here. And, that is the liver. It's a very large organ in the burbot, larger than we would see in other fish around here. Moving down, we can dig out the digestive tract as well, looking for the stomach. Let's see. Where are you, stomach? No, that's part of the liver. Get some intestine there. A pretty. Oh, where the stomach went. I went up the mouth. Yeah, because the air bladder went out. So, that's something you'll see. As if we're talking, catch and release on fish, barotrauma, especially when the gas bladder goes out the mouth, that can be a pretty big issue for survival on fish, because that stomach is actually up into the mouth, and that's obviously not a good thing. One of the ways to deal with barotrauma with fish, if they're just kind of inflated, you can actually lower them back down to depth so they have some time to equilibrize. Ooh. Yeah, and so our stomach has kind of gone inside out, unfortunately. And so we've got our stomach here, pushed out by that gas bladder. And yeah, at this point, not much in here. Fortunately, earlier in the day when we did have a fish with an intact stomach, actually pulled out 2 round gobies. So that's a benthic fish, fairly common in Lake Michigan right now. And we actually, it's hard to see, but the head of a possum shrimp, a mysis. So, as we kind of go through the stomach, we've got the pyloric portion of the stomach, lots of absorption happening. The intestines after that, and back there, and then we have the ovaries. So looks like another female, developing here, pretty big, but not quite ready to spawn yet. Yeah, so much juicier this time.
Show them the part what you eat.
Oh yeah, so if you were going to eat, the sort of the best really along this back on both sides. Kind of a nice meaty portion right here, not much for bones, really no bones in there at all. So yeah, tasty, good to eat. Does anyone have any questions about the burbot?
Any good fish stories?
Any burbot stories?
I have a
Anybody's got
question.
any questions? Or,
I have a question.
oh, can you deliver?
Can you deliver? Yeah. So, I think one of the concerns with livers, there are some parasite issues, but some of the literature, they actually looked at canning them, so that would kill anything. It was a pretty nutritious food source there. Maybe you could cook them too. I don't know that anyone has tried that. It's an idea though.
What kind of trends can be looked at with ice coverage average decreasing and burbot spawning? Does it affect the population in any significant way?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Looking at the trends in ice cover, spawning, and that's a good question. And generally we don't know. Not a lot of people are looking at winter ecology in general. Probably not looking at whether or not that there's an ice cover relationship between spawning success and burbot, but definitely kind of an interesting area to maybe look at in the future.
Would you talk a little bit again, Titus, about why the stomach went up into the mouth?
Okay, yeah. So why did that happen to the stomach? So basically this burbot was on the bottom, might have been down 100 or 120 feet, and at that depth. There's a lot of pressure from all that water on top. It might be 4 or 5 atmospheres of pressure. And so, the gas bladder is very small down on the bottom. But if a fish comes up very rapidly, that same volume of gas with all that pressure will expand. So when it gets to the surface, that gas bladder is really expanded in that cavity, and the stomach is kind of reversed out into the mouth. So, a very unfortunate thing to happen. This barotrauma, when you talk about fisheries for reef fish, things like rockfish in the ocean, some of the deep water fish in the Gulf, pulling them up from really deep depths, they can really, expand out as that gas bladder fills. They might get Popeye. That's another, issue that you can see with some of these fish. And the way to deal with that, you can actually lower some of those fish down to the depth they were caught at, and then as they go down, the air will kind of get smaller, and a lot of times that'll help them recover. Perch, yellow perch, this can be a problem, and even in fairly shallow water. So even some of the science out in Lake Erie, 20 or 30 feet of water, pulling up a perch, might have that barotrauma. Other species like lake trout, they're actually able to kind of expel some of that air out of their gas bladder directly, and they seem a little more resilient to that happening.
How blind are the burbot? Are you blind as a burbot, or can they see pretty well?
Blind as a burbot? Yeah, another great question that I don't know how well anyone's really looked at that. They are a nocturnal species, so how important is eyesight going to be? I have not run into any, visual science on them yet. So maybe we don't really know how great they can see. Oh, where is the heart? People do ask about the heart. We had that question this morning, and it's, really right up towards the front, kind of behind the little in front of the liver here. So, fairly small, but it is definitely in there.
So you're saying it's not near a lower part of their anatomy, like some people have speculated, or like a lawyers would be?
That's right.
Okay. Would the lateral line benefit the burbot as a deep water species?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. It's another great question that maybe we haven't studied that much, and I think it would be hard to really study that. But again, being able to kind of detect things outside of your field of view could be a very useful kind of skill to have at night if you're nocturnal. So you can maybe locate things that are out of your field of view and avoid them if they're lake trout, but maybe if they're food, you can go after them.
So we've had a couple questions about fishing for burbot. One was bait. What kind of bait should somebody use to catch a burbot? And then the other one was, can you catch them fishing from a pier on Lake Michigan?
All right, two great questions. So the image that I had, it's sort of similar. You're kind of jigging on the bottom, so you want to have something that weight on the bottom with a little, kind of. If you're familiar with jigging for whitefish, I think it's kind of a similar thing. The whitefish out in Green Bay right now, people catch them on little jigs that kind of look like round gobies, and I think that would be similar with the burbot. Catching them off piers. Milwaukee, actually, Paul Smith, who he writes for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. He's the outdoor reporter. See him in kind of all the Gannett media papers. He actually wrote a story a little over a year ago about people catching burbot in the Milwaukee Harbor. So, I think they were either right off the kind of channel into the river there, or potentially on the ice. I know, down in Milwaukee, people fish through the ice for brown trout, but maybe burbot would turn up there as well. All right, we're continuing to monitor questions.
That's fine. Yeah, I feel like somebody typed a question and for some reason it's not showing up. Would you type your question again?
I'll check the chat here too.
Okay. Yeah, that one didn't show.
Let's see. Locally, there are burbot and some smaller inland lakes here. Any significant differences in diet in a lake with less bottom-dwelling fish like sculpins and gobies? Yeah, as a generalist, the burbot is probably going to key in on different fish that are in different water bodies. Lake Winnebago has a burbot population, and that is maximum depth of like 12 feet. So definitely different fish there, but you're going to still have bottom associated fish, things like darters or other small fish that I think a burbot would feed on as well. All right. Any final questions? Definitely thanks again for joining us. I hope you learned some things about burbot. I definitely learned a lot just kind of preparing for this presentation. It's always fun to really dig into the science of native species that are maybe not well known, not an important sport fish, but still an important part of our ecosystem and really interesting fish to get to know.
So thanks once again to Dr. Titus Seilheimer.
Oh, it's like I'm in a stadium. This is great.
Thanks for everybody for joining us tonight. Door County Maritime Museum here. We do a speaker series the first Thursday of the month from November to May next month On March 4th, 7 p.m., Diana Stempfler is going to be here for Women's History Month, talking about the Ladies of the Lights of Lake Michigan. So I hope you can join us. We'll share it on our Facebook page, Door County Maritime Museum. It's on our YouTube channel, Door County Maritime. And we look forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks.